Good morning, scholars, and welcome to Mr. Wolstenholme's yard. Today I'm going to talk to you guys about symbiosis. Symbiosis is any relationship between two different organisms. Now, typically when people talk about symbiosis, they tend to think about mutualism, which is when both organisms benefit, but really any relationship between two organisms could be an example of a symbiotic relationship. So, predation, where one is killing the other, that's a type of symbiosis. Mutualism, where they both benefit, that is symbiosis. Commensalism, where one benefits and the other doesn't really care, that's symbiosis. Parasitism, where one benefits and the other one's hurt but not killed, that would be symbiosis too. So symbiosis is any relationship between two living organisms. So I'll be looking around my backyard today and I'll see how many examples of symbiotic relationships I can find, and I'll share with you what I find. As you can see here, I have some ants on my Rose of Sharon bush here, and whenever I see ants walking around on plants, like these guys do, I immediately think of a really cool mutualistic relationship. So here's that relationship here. This is, let me try and get a good shot here. This is a bunch of aphids on the underside of this leaf. And what these ants are doing is they're actually herding these aphids. They're bringing them to the fresh new leaves. You can see these are the newest leaves. They're the most tender. They have the most readily accessible sap. And so these aphids are going to drink that sap, and then they're actually going to excrete this liquid called honeydew, which is this sweet, sugary, leftover sap after they've digested it. And the ants like to drink that. So these aphids are basically cattle for the ants. Now, aphids are not the only organism that ants do this with. They actually do it with some caterpillars too, which we are lucky enough to see right here. You see that little caterpillar there with the ants crawling on it? Those ants are not going to hurt it, because they are benefiting from it. So this would be a perfect example of a mutualistic relationship between the ants and the aphids and that caterpillar as well. Look at all of these aphids on this leaf here. You can imagine that this is very undesirable for this bush, to have all of these aphids sucking the sap out of it. So this is also another example of a symbiotic relationship. This is an example of parasitism. Now, this is a big bush. These aphids are not going to kill the tree, but they're certainly harming it. They're making it harder for its new growth to survive. So they're feeding on it but not killing it. This is a great example of parasitism, which is yet another example of symbiosis. Check this out. This is another great example of parasitism here. This is a gall from a wasp on an oak tree. So you can see this leaf here is turned into this weird balloon looking thing. So what happened here is you had a normal oak leaf that was just in an early stage of development, like that little guy there. And while it was still young, it got injected with an egg from a wasp. And that actually mutates the leaf cells as they develop, and it grows into this gall, which is basically a protective sac for the baby wasps. This isn't going to kill the tree or anything like that. The tree will survive. It's just damaged because it's wasting its nutrients building this for the wasps instead of helping itself. It also reduces the amount of photosynthesis it's able to do. Now, this tree, it's got several of these galls. There's actually quite a few of them now that I'm looking at it. So there's probably a number of wasps that are parasitizing this tree. Now, wasps love to do this sort of thing. That's one of their MOs, is to inject their eggs into some other organism and allow their larvae to develop in them. A lot of times they'll do this in insects like caterpillars. In this way, wasps are actually really important to us because they help keep agricultural pests down. But in that case, the larva will develop inside of the caterpillar, and the caterpillar will die as the larva emerges. And so that would be an example of something called a parasitoid. A parasitoid is just a parasite that eventually kills its hosts. Another type of symbiotic relationship is commensalism. Commensalism is when one party benefits and the other party is neither harmed nor benefits from that relationship. And there's some debate about whether or not commensalism is actually a thing, because some people say when push comes to shove, if you take any relationship to its extreme, it will either benefit or harm somebody. So I'm going to give you an example of that. I have this very old tree stump here in my backyard, and if you look close at it, you can see that there's lots of fungus growing on it. I have some mushrooms, I have some shelf fungus. I'm not sure what kind this is, but this is feeding on the deceased wood here. So you can see this wood is very soft. So these are decomposers. They're also known as detritivores. They eat dead things, and you could argue that they have a commensalistic relationship with the trees. They're certainly not harming the tree because the tree is already dead, but they are certainly benefiting from the carcass of that tree. So that could be an example of commensalism. However, you could also argue that these detritivores release those nutrients back into the ecosystem, and they allow future generations of trees to have access to them. So in that way, if you look at the long picture of this would actually be an example of a mutualistic relationship. If I look closely at this branch, I can see that there's lots of green lichens growing on this bush here. These green lichens are probably not hurting the plant. They're not sucking any nutrients out of it. They're not on the leaves, so they're not inhibiting photosynthesis, and they're too light to really be causing any strain on this plant. So these lichens are probably a good example of a commensalistic relationship between these lichens and the tree. The lichens benefit because they get a structure to grow on, but they don't really hurt the host plant at all. So this is probably commensalism. Some people might argue that if you get too many of them, they might weigh the branch down or get in the way of photosynthesis. But at least at this point, this would be a commensalistic relationship. Look at this predator in action, just looking around, waiting for some innocent seed to prey upon. Maybe an insect. Oh, we got another one. There it is. Oh, that one actually has something. And it's preying upon it. Vicious. Usually when we think about predation, we tend to think of mammal predators like hyenas, foxes, wolves, lions. But predation is any time an organism kills another organism to eat it. So that house sparrow is a good example of that because it kills the seeds that it eats. It kills the insects that it hunts and eats. So that is a great example of predation, which again, that is a type of symbiosis because it's a relationship between two organisms. Okay, so today we learned that symbiosis is any relationship between two organisms, and we've seen examples of the major types here in my yard. Mutualism, predation, commensalism, and parasitism. As always, I hope you enjoyed the video, I hope you learned something, and I'll see you in the future.